When I first saw the job listing, I thought it had to be a mistake. $100 an hour for a security position? It sounded like the kind of absurd typo you'd find in one of those spammy work-from-home scams. But desperation can make you overlook a lot, and I was desperate. Weeks of job applications and rejections had left me numb to my own skepticism. I applied anyway, figuring the worst they could do was ghost me like all the others. To my surprise, I received a call the very next day from a man named Dean, who introduced himself as the hiring manager. The first thing I noticed about Dean was the noise in the background of the call clang after clang, like metal on metal. It gave me the impression he was standing in the middle of a construction site or maybe a scrapyard. His voice, however, was warm and eager, almost excessively so. "Is this Jordan?" he asked, though it felt like he already knew the answer. "Yeah, this is Jordan," I replied hesitantly. "Great. This is Dean calling about the security job you applied for. I wanted to see if you're still interested and maybe set up a quick interview." I glanced at the clock. It was a little after noon, and the day stretched ahead of me, empty as usual. Sure. When and where?" Dean seemed relieved. He rattled off the address of a nearby coffee shop, adding that 3 o'clock would work best for him. He thanked me profusely before hanging up, leaving me staring at my phone in mild confusion. His enthusiasm felt mismatched to the situation, but maybe he was just grateful to have someone respond to the ad. Either way, I wasn't about to question my luck, not yet. When I arrived at the coffee shop later that afternoon, Dean was already waiting. He stood out immediately, tall and wiry with hair so blonde it was nearly white. He wore a navy blue suit that was just slightly too small, the sleeves cutting off well above his wrists and his pant legs barely brushing his ankles. Despite the ill fit, he carried himself with a strange, almost manic confidence, his bright yellow tie flashing like a warning sign in the sunlight. We exchanged pleasantries, and he wasted no time diving into the details of the job, or at least what little he was willing to share. "It's pretty straightforward," he said, clasping his hands together. "You'd be guarding a building, 5 nights a week, from 9 at night to midnight. Nothing too crazy." Something about his tone made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I asked what kind of building it was, and he hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. "It's an old restaurant," he said finally. "Cheeky's, if you've heard of it." I hadn't. Dean seemed eager to brush past my questions, emphasizing instead the generous pay and the limited hours. His answers were vague, almost deliberately so, but I didn't push. At $100 an hour, I wasn't about to turn him down. "Great," he said, beaming as he shook my hand. "I'll send you the address and schedule tomorrow. Oh, and there's no training. Brandon will fill you in on your first shift." Brandon, as I would later learn, was one of the other guards. And while I didn't know it yet, he would also be the one to deliver the cryptic set of rules that turned this already strange job into something far darker. The following week, I drove out to the address Dean had emailed me. It was farther from the city than I expected, tucked away in a semi-rural area that felt isolated even in daylight. The restaurant itself was surrounded by a chain-link fence plastered with no trespassing signs. The building had clearly seen better days. Its faded sign, featuring a cartoonish yellow dog, hung lopsided above the boarded-up windows. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, and the dirt parking lot was empty, save for 2 other cars. I parked next to them and walked toward a small trailer stationed behind the restaurant. As I approached, a breeze rattled the fence, and I paused, scanning the tree line for movement. There was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the property. The door to the trailer opened, and a man with long hair and a tattoo on his neck stepped out. "You Jordan?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, stepping closer. "Brandon," he introduced himself. He handed me a flashlight and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, I'll show you around." Inside the trailer, another man sat in front of a bank of security monitors, his back to us. The screens displayed various angles of the restaurant, but there was little to see apart from shadows and peeling paint. A 4th screen in the corner was labeled "Out of Order" with a bright orange sticky note. "That's Mark," Brandon said, gesturing toward the man at the monitors. Mark gave a small nod without turning around. The tour was brief. and unsettling. Brandon led me around the fenced perimeter, rattling off a series of rules that seemed more suited to a horror movie than a security job. Rule 1, he began. No bright colors, only dark clothing. Got it? I nodded, though I couldn't imagine why it mattered. Rule 2, we do perimeter checks every hour, no excuses. Last one's at midnight before we leave. Again I nodded, though the rigid structure of the job felt increasingly odd. And Rule 3, Brandon said, lowering his voice. This one's the most important. Under no circumstances do you go inside the building. Got it? I glanced at the boarded-up windows and faded exit signs. What's in there? Brandon smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Nothing you want to meet. I laughed nervously, expecting him to clarify, but he didn't. We finished the circuit in silence, and by the time we returned to the trailer, my unease had solidified into something colder and sharper. Whatever this job was, it wasn't normal. But the pay was too good to walk away from. The first night was uneventful, at least at first. I spent the first hour sitting in the cramped trailer with Mark and Brandon, watching the security monitors flicker between views of the desolate property. Mark was a man of few words, his attention glued to the screens as he flipped a pen between his fingers. Brandon, on the other hand, was restless, pacing the small space like a caged animal. I got the sense that he wasn't the type to sit still for long. At 9 o'clock, Brandon grabbed a flashlight and went out for the first perimeter check. Watch the monitors, he said over his shoulder. If you see anything weird, radio me. Weird? I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but the trailer door slammed shut before I could get the words out. I turned to Mark, who seemed wholly uninterested in conversation. You ever see anything out there? I asked, hoping to fill the silence. Mark didn't look away from the screens. Sometimes. What kind of sometimes? He shrugged, the scar on his cheek tugging slightly as he smirked. Weird shit. You'll see soon enough. I didn't press him further. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the occasional static crackle from the radio. I found myself watching the out-of-order screen more than the others, its black void somehow more unnerving than the shadowy footage on the working monitors. My eyes kept drifting to it as though expecting something to flicker to life within its darkness. Brandon returned a few minutes later, looking bored. All clear, he said, tossing the flashlight onto the table. Your turn next, newbie. The hours dragged on, the monotony broken only by the scheduled perimeter checks. When my turn came at 11, I took the flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The property was eerily quiet, the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of the fence the only sounds to accompany my footsteps. I swept the flashlight in wide arcs, scanning for anything out of place. As I passed the side of the building, the beam of light caught the faded exit painted above one of the doors. The paint looked fresh, too fresh for a building that had been abandoned for years. I hesitated, the cold night air pricking at the back of my neck. Somewhere in the distance a faint tapping noise echoed. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to be coming from inside the building. My first instinct was to radio Mark or Brandon, but something stopped me. Instead, I stepped closer to the door, pressing my ear against the cold metal. Help! The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I stumbled back, shining the flashlight at the door as my mind raced. It sounded human, desperate, and weak. Against every instinct, I reached for the handle, but a sudden burst of static from the walkie-talkie stopped me. Jordan! Mark's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and urgent. Walk away from the building, now! I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I heard something. There's someone in there. No! Mark snapped, his voice cutting through the static. There isn't. Get back to the trailer. That's an order. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in Mark's tone stopped me. Reluctantly, I stepped back from the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The tapping noise had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Back in the trailer, Mark and Brandon were waiting, their faces grim. Mark didn't say anything, just pointed to the chair I'd vacated earlier. Brandon, on the other hand, was pacing again, his movements jittery and restless. "You didn't go in, did you?" Brandon asked, his voice tight. "No," I said, sinking into the chair, "but I heard something, a voice. It said, 'Help.'" Brandon exchanged a glance with Mark, who shook his head. "Don't trust anything you hear near that building," Mark said. "It's not real." "What do you mean it's not real? It sounded real to me." Mark sighed, finally turning away from the monitors to face me. "Look, I don't know what you think you heard, but nothing good ever comes from going inside. If you want to keep this job and your sanity, you'll stay the hell away from that building." Brandon nodded, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. "Rule number 3 exists for a reason, man. You break it, you're on your own." I wanted to press them for more details, but the tension in the trailer was palpable. It was clear they weren't going to tell me anything more, at least not tonight. I sat back, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. The rest of the shift passed in uneasy silence. Every so often I thought I heard faint noises coming from the building, a soft scraping, a muffled thump, but I forced myself to ignore them. By the time midnight rolled around, I was ready to get the hell out of there. As I drove home, the events of the night replayed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark and Brandon were hiding something far worse than trespassers or urban legends. The voice I'd heard inside the building was too real, too human to dismiss. But if there really was someone or something in there, what was it? And why were we being paid so much to keep it locked away? The questions gnawed at me, but I knew better than to bring them up when I returned from my second shift the next night. Whatever was happening at Cheeky's, I had a feeling I wouldn't like the answers. The second night began much like the first, but I was more on edge. The memory of that faint voice and the tapping noises stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Brandon and Mark didn't seem much happier to be there, their usual gruff banter replaced with terse silences and sidelong glances at the security monitors. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something I desperately needed to know. At 9 o'clock I took the first perimeter check. The night air was colder, the wind biting against my skin as I walked the fence line with the flashlight. The property was deathly silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. As I neared the building, my steps slowed. The exit door loomed ahead of me, its red lettering almost glowing in the dim light of the trailer's lamps. I told myself to keep walking, to finish the check and get back to the trailer. But then I heard it again. A faint tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere inside the building. My pulse quickened as I swept the flashlight across the door, searching for any sign of movement. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. "Help!" The voice was louder this time, clearer. It sounded like a young woman, her voice trembling with fear. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the voice repeated, "Please, help me." "Jordan," Brandon's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie, startling me. "Get away from the building." I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. "There's someone in there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not imagining it." "I don't care what you think you heard," Brandon replied, his voice low and urgent. "Get back to the trailer. Now." I hesitated, torn between following orders and listening to my instincts. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. What if someone was trapped in there, hurt, or worse? But the memory of Brandon's warning and Mark's cold, unflinching stare kept me rooted to the spot. I took a step back, then another, forcing myself to turn away from the door. The voice called out again, a strangled, pitiful cry that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't look back as I hurried back to the trailer, my pulse racing. When I stepped inside, Brandon and Mark were waiting. Brandon looked pale, his usual swagger replaced with a nervous energy that made him seem smaller somehow. Mark didn't say a word, just nodded toward the empty chair. "You're lucky," Brandon said, his voice tight. "Most people don't make it back after hearing that voice." "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "What's inside that building?" Brandon looked at Mark, who shook his head. "You don't want to know." Mark said flatly. Trust me. I think I deserve an explanation, I said, my voice rising. You can't just expect me to sit here and ignore. Enough, Mark snapped, his voice like a whip crack. He turned to face me, his scarred face shadowed in the dim light. You want answers? Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. For a moment I thought he might change his mind, but then he spoke, his voice low and even. About a year before Cheeky's shut down, there was an incident, he began. A guy working there, some college kid, went missing during his shift. He was wearing the mascot costume, the big yellow dog on the sign. The cameras caught him going into the storage room, but he never came back out. They found the costume a few days later, stuffed in the freezer. No sign of the kid, the yai. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. What does that have to do with the voice? Mark's expression darkened. After the kid went missing, strange things started happening. Employees heard voices, saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. A few of them quit on the spot, swearing the place was haunted. The owners tried to keep it quiet, but word got out. Customers started noticing things too, objects moving on their own, lights flickering for no reason. It got so bad they had to shut the place down. Brandon nodded, his face pale. They tried selling the building, but no one wanted it. Too many rumors, too much bad history. So the company kept it, locked it up tight, and hired people like us to keep an eye on it. But what's inside? I pressed. What's making the noises, the voices? Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. We don't know, and we don't want to know. All we're here to do is keep people out and make sure whatever's in there stays inside. That's it. His words sent a chill down my spine. Whatever was in that building, it wasn't just some prank or urban legend. It was real, and it was dangerous. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing as I tried to piece together everything I'd learned. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't hear the voice again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time my shift ended, I was more than ready to leave. But as I drove home, the questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The third night was the breaking point. By the time I arrived at the site, my nerves were already frayed. Sleep had evaded me the night before, my mind haunted by the voice and the stories Mark had shared. I found myself jumping at shadows, my heart racing at the smallest noise. I kept telling myself it was just a job, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Something was wrong with this place, and it was pulling me in piece by piece. When I entered the trailer, Brandon and Mark were already there. Brandon looked tired, his usual smug expression replaced with one of weary resignation. Mark, as always, was stoic, his scarred face betraying nothing. Neither of them spoke as I took my seat and stared at the security monitors. The first perimeter check was mine again. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grass and making the chain-link fence rattle. The building loomed ahead of me, its boarded-up windows like empty eyes staring into the void. I followed the same path as the night before, sweeping the flashlight across the fence line and the surrounding area. Everything seemed normal at first, but as I approached the exit door, the air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I stopped, listening, but there was nothing, only the sound of the wind and my own breathing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It came from inside the building, resonating through the thick walls like the hum of an engine. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the growl grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, of that, I was certain. "Jordan," Mark's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie, startling me. "Get back to the trailer, now." I turned to respond, but before I could say anything, the growl turned into a roar. The sound was deafening, shaking me to my core. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, part animal, part something else entirely. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest as the sound reverberated through the night. "I'm coming back," I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I made my way back to the trailer. The roar followed me, growing fainter with each step, until it finally faded into silence. When I burst into the trailer, Brandon and Mark were waiting, their faces pale. Brandon looked like he was about to be sick, while Mark's expression was unreadable. He nodded toward the empty chair, and I sank into it, my hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the monitors, his jaw clenched. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "We told you," Mark said finally, his voice low and steady. "You don't want to know." The rest of the shift passed in a tense, uneasy silence. None of us spoke, our eyes glued to the monitors as we waited for something, anything to happen. But the building remained still, the boarded windows and locked doors hiding whatever horrors lay inside. At midnight, Brandon took the final perimeter check. I watched him on the monitors as he made his way around the building, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He moved quickly, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. When he reached the exit door, he hesitated, shining the flashlight on it for a moment before shaking his head and continuing on. He returned a few minutes later, his face pale. "All clear," he said, dropping into his chair. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see the fear in his eyes. As the shift ended, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. Mark stopped me at the door, his scarred face illuminated by the harsh light of the trailer. "Be careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This job, it gets to people. Don't let it get to you." I nodded, too tired and too scared to argue. As I drove home, the words echoed in my mind, mingling with the roar and the voice that still haunted me. I didn't know how much more of this I could take, but I needed the money. Quitting wasn't an option, at least, not yet. The fourth night was worse. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt it, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to seep into my very bones. The air was colder, the wind sharper, and the silence deeper. Even Brandon and Mark seemed affected, their usual banter replaced with uneasy glances and terse instructions. The first perimeter check was mine again, and I set out with the flashlight, my heart pounding with every step. The building loomed ahead of me, its dark silhouette like a wound against the night sky. As I approached the exit door, I heard it again, the growl, low and menacing, like a predator circling its prey. This time I didn't stop. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I made my way back to the trailer. I could feel it behind me, a presence that pressed against my back like a hand reaching out to pull me in. When I burst into the trailer, Brandon and Mark were already on their feet, their faces pale. "It's getting stronger," Brandon said, his voice trembling. "Whatever's in there, it's not happy." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to be careful," he said. "If it gets out..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. We all knew what he meant. That fourth night was a blur of tension and unspoken fear. Mark's words stuck with me. "If it gets out." The statement echoed like a prophecy, filling the silence as the hours crawled by. We all sat in the trailer, watching the monitors as if they might reveal some grand truth. They didn't. Instead, the screens showed the same desolate view: the overgrown lot, the chain-link fence, the crumbling restaurant shrouded in darkness. The only signs of life were the occasional movements of rats or the flutter of moths around the dim exterior lights. At 10 o'clock, Brandon went out for the first perimeter check. I watched him on the monitors, my stomach twisting with unease. He moved slower than usual, his flashlight flickering as it illuminated the patches of dead grass and boarded-up windows. When he reached the exit door, he stopped, the light pausing on the red lettering for a moment too long. Then, with a shake of his head, he moved on, disappearing around the side of the building. When he returned, his face was pale, and he avoided eye contact with both Mark and me. He sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the monitors without a word. His silence was contagious, and neither Mark nor I dared to break it. At 11 o'clock, it was Mark's turn. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the cold night without a word. The trailer door closed behind him with a metallic clank that seemed louder than it should have been. I watched him on the monitors, my breath caught in my throat as he made his way around the building. Unlike Brandon, he moved with purpose, his shoulders squared and his steps steady. But when he reached the exit door, he stopped. His flashlight wavered as he stared at the red letters, his body rigid. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, he raised his hand to his walkie-talkie and spoke, his voice crackling through the speaker in the trailer. "I heard something," he said. "It's coming from inside." Brandon and I exchanged a look. My stomach dropped as the growl started again, low and guttural, vibrating through the air like a distant thunderstorm. On the monitor, I saw Mark take a step back, his flashlight shaking. "Get back here," Brandon said into his walkie-talkie, his voice tight with urgency. "Now!" Mark didn't respond. Instead, he turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted back to the trailer. The growl grew louder, and I saw a shadow move behind the exit door, a fleeting glimpse of something large and unnatural. When Mark burst through the trailer door, he was breathing hard, his face slick with sweat. He slammed the door shut behind him and locked it, leaning against it as if he expected something to burst through at any moment. "It's awake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and it knows we're here." We spent the next hour in a state of near paralysis, too scared to leave the trailer but too afraid to stay put. The monitors showed nothing unusual, but the growls continued, rising and falling in intensity like a terrible rhythm. The air in the trailer grew heavy, the tension thick enough to choke on. At midnight, it was my turn for the perimeter check. I wanted to refuse. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and throw away the key. But I couldn't. Mark and Brandon were both watching me, their faces pale but expectant. It was my turn, and I couldn't back out without breaking the unspoken code we'd all been following. I grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, and the silence was deafening. I moved slowly, my heart pounding as I approached the building. The growls had stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet that was somehow worse. When I reached the exit door, I stopped. The flashlight beam landed on the red letters, the paint shining wetly in the dim light. My breath fogged the air as I stared at the door, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn back. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and quivering, coming from inside the building. "Help me." It was the same voice I'd heard before, weak and desperate. It sent a shiver down my spine, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. I thought about the stories Mark and Brandon had told me, about the missing employee and the strange experiments. Was this him? Was he still alive in there, trapped and suffering? "Jordan!" Mark's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Get back to the trailer, now!" I hesitated, the flashlight beam wavering as I stared at the door. The voice called out again, louder this time. "Help me, please. I can't just leave him," I said into the walkie-talkie, my voice shaking. "What if he's hurt?" "Jordan, don't!" Brandon's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "It's not what you think. Get back here now." But it was too late. I'd already made up my mind. I stepped forward, reaching for the door handle, ignoring the protests crackling through the walkie-talkie. I had to know the truth. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang, plunging me into complete darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the flashlight, its beam cutting through the suffocating blackness. The air was thick, carrying a stench so foul it nearly made me gag a mix of rotting meat, mildew, and something metallic like blood. The weak voice that had lured me in was gone now, leaving only silence. I swept the flashlight around the room, revealing peeling wallpaper, shattered furniture, and debris scattered across the floor. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside. Rat carcasses littered the floor, their bodies unnaturally twisted as if they'd been crushed by something far stronger than they were. The smell was worse here, almost unbearable, Jordan! Mark's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie on my belt. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Get out of there, now! I'm fine, I lied, my voice trembling. I think there's someone in here. I just need to check. Don't you dare finish that sentence, Brandon barked. You have no idea what you're dealing with. But I ignored them. Something had been calling for help, and now that I was inside, I had to know what it was. The flashlight beam landed on a hallway ahead, its walls smeared with something dark and dried. It wasn't paint. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I took slow, deliberate steps, the sound of my boots crunching against broken glass and debris echoing around me. With each step, the flashlight flickered, threatening to go out completely. I tapped it against my palm, muttering curses under my breath. The farther I ventured, the colder it became. My breath fogged the air as frost began to creep along the walls, creating strange, jagged patterns. And then I heard it, a wet, slithering sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I scanned the hallway, the beam darting from wall to wall. There was nothing there, but the sound continued, closer now. Jordan, do you hear me? Mark's voice cut through the walkie-talkie again, frantic. It's awake. It knows you're in there. Get the hell out. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft, rhythmic creak of something swaying. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned the flashlight toward the ceiling. My heart stopped. Hanging from the rafters was what remained of a man. His body was emaciated, the skin yellowed and stretched taut over protruding bones. His head hung at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted like a piece of crumpled wire. But it was his face that truly terrified me. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and his mouth was frozen in a grotesque grin. His jaw hung loose, as if it had been unhinged, and from it dangled strands of yellow fur. The man was wearing a tattered version of the Cheeky's mascot costume. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat as the beam of the flashlight trembled in my hand. The body swayed slightly, creaking as it moved, and for a moment I thought I saw its hand twitch. I turned, stumbling toward the door I had come through, but it was gone. The hallway behind me stretched endlessly, the exit nowhere in sight. Jordan, are you still there? Brandon's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. My legs felt like lead as I took another step forward, my mind racing. I had to find another way out. The slithering sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It reverberated through the walls, vibrating the very air around me. The flashlight flickered again, and in its brief moments of darkness, I saw something move at the end of the hallway. It was massive, its shadow blotting out the faint light from a cracked window at the far end. No, I whispered to myself, backing away. The growl grew louder, a terrible rumbling sound that shook me to my core, and then it stepped into the light. The creature was a nightmare made flesh. Its body was grotesquely twisted, covered in patches of matted yellow fur that barely clung to its rotting flesh. Its head resembled that of a dog, but the snout was elongated and its jaw hung open, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, locking onto me with an intelligence that was far too human. It moved on all fours, its elongated limbs contorting unnaturally as it advanced. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. The creature tilted its head, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Then it smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a bark and a laugh, and then it lunged. I screamed, throwing myself to the side just as the creature slammed into the spot where I had been standing. The impact sent a shockwave through the floor, and I scrambled to my feet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The creature snarled, its massive claws scraping against the walls as it turned to face me. "Help!" I shouted into the walkie-talkie, my voice cracking. "It's here! It's in here with me! Jordan, get out of there. Mark's voice came through, desperate. Find a way out, now! But there was no way out. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the walls closing in as the creature stalked toward me. I backed away, my mind racing for a solution. My foot hit something hard, and I glanced down to see a metal pipe lying on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed it and held it in front of me like a sword. The creature lunged again, and I swung the pipe with all my strength. It connected with the side of its head, and the creature let out a deafening roar, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop it. It shook its head, the glow in its eyes intensifying as it let out another guttural growl. I turned and ran, my legs finally obeying me. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls narrowing and expanding in unnatural ways. Doors appeared and disappeared as I ran, their handles rusted and useless. The creature was right behind me, its claws scraping against the floor as it gave chase. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the endless hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The creature's growls were deafening now, so close I could almost feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. My muscles burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant death, worse than death, maybe. I rounded a corner and nearly slipped on something slick and wet. The flashlight beam caught it, a smear of fresh blood leading to a crumpled body propped against the wall. It was Brandon. His chest had been ripped open, ribs jutting out like broken branches, and his eyes stared blankly ahead, frozen in terror. His walkie-talkie was still clutched in his lifeless hand, the device crackling faintly with static. "Brandon," I whispered, my voice trembling. But there was no time to grieve. The creature's claws scraped against the wall as it rounded the corner behind me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It let out another guttural snarl and charged. I turned and ran again, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, warping and twisting as if the building itself was alive, conspiring to keep me trapped. Doors lined the walls, but every handle I tried was locked or rusted shut. The flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm, praying it wouldn't go out. If I was plunged into darkness now, I wouldn't stand a chance. A loud crash echoed behind me, followed by a scream of metal being shredded. I glanced back to see the creature tearing through a steel door as if it were paper. Its strength was monstrous, its movements horrifyingly fluid despite its twisted, unnatural form. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest as I searched desperately for an escape. And then up ahead I saw it, a staircase descending into darkness. It was my only option. I threw myself toward it, stumbling as I reached the top step. The creature roared, its claws scraping against the floor as it closed in. I didn't think. I just flung myself down the stairs, tumbling painfully as the flashlight flew from my grasp and clattered against the wall. I hit the bottom with a grunt, my shoulders screaming in pain. The creature paused at the top of the stairs, snarling as it peered down at me. Its glowing eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, and for a moment I thought it was going to leap. Instead, it tilted its head almost as if it were amused. Then, it let out a sound, a chilling, guttural laugh that echoed through the stairwell. It turned and disappeared into the darkness above, its footsteps growing fainter until there was silence. I lay there for a moment, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. My entire body ached, and blood trickled down my forehead from a cut I hadn't even realized I'd sustained. The flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam casting erratic shadows on the damp concrete walls. I reached for it with trembling hands and pulled myself to my feet. The stairwell was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The walls were lined with pipes, some of them leaking water that dripped steadily onto the floor. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The creature might have left, but it wouldn't stay gone for long. I needed to find a way out. The stairs led down to a narrow hallway, its floor slick with water and something else, something thicker, darker. I tried not to think about it as I moved cautiously forward, the flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the concrete that I couldn't decipher. They seemed ancient, almost ritualistic, and they glowed faintly in the dim light. Ahead, the hallway opened into a larger room. I stepped inside, my heart sinking as I took in my surroundings. The room was massive, its walls lined with cages, rusted, twisted cages, each one barely big enough to hold a person. Most of them were empty, but a few contained remains, skeletal figures huddled in unnatural positions, their bones gnawed and broken. The stench was overwhelming, a sickening mix of decay and something chemical. In the center of the room stood a large circular pit. Its edges were lined with more of those strange, glowing symbols, and a faint, pulsing light emanated from within. I approached cautiously, peering over the edge. The pit seemed bottomless, its depths shrouded in darkness, but the light grew stronger the closer I got, and then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing. It came from the pit, deep and guttural, resonating through the room. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't just breathing, it was laughter. Low, rumbling laughter that grew louder with each passing second. "Jonah," a voice whispered, soft and mocking. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice came from the pit, but it echoed all around me as if the room itself were speaking. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it became a cacophony of sound, overwhelming my senses. I stumbled back, clutching my ears as the flashlight slipped from my grasp. "Jonah, join us," the voice called again, and I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle. I looked down, horror gripping me as I saw a long, clawed hand emerging from the pit. It was covered in matted fur, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with razor-sharp claws. The hand tightened its grip, pulling me toward the edge. "No!" I screamed, kicking wildly as I tried to break free. The claws dug into my skin, sending searing pain up my leg. I grabbed the flashlight, swinging it with all my strength. The beam struck the hand, and it recoiled with a deafening screech, retreating back into the pit. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I stumbled back into the hallway. The laughter followed me, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the pit. My only thought was escape, getting out of this nightmare before it consumed me completely. I sprinted through the hallway, the oppressive darkness closing in around me. My mind raced, replaying the grotesque images and horrifying sounds that had unfolded in that cursed room. My leg throbbed with every step, the claw marks burning like fire, but I couldn't stop. Not when I knew that pit and whatever was inside it were just the beginning of this nightmare. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, the walls narrowing and expanding unpredictably. Every so often I'd hear whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My name repeated over and over as though the building was alive and mocking my desperation. "Jonah, turn back." I stumbled into a larger space, a room with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. It was a kitchen, or what used to be one. Rusted ovens and broken refrigerators lined the walls, and a long, grimy counter stretched across the middle of the room. The air was thick with the stench of rotting food and something far worse, something metallic and acrid that made my stomach churn. In the center of the room lay a body, sprawled across the filthy tiles. It was Mark. His lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling, and his mouth hung open in a frozen scream. His gun was still clutched in his hand, though it had done him no good. His chest had been torn apart, ribs exposed, and flesh shredded. The sight of him sent a wave of nausea rolling through me, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, a sound behind me, a low growl, deep and guttural. I whipped around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw it. The creature. It stood in the doorway, its massive form hunched and twisted, its glowing yellow eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. Blood dripped from its claws, pooling on the floor beneath it. It didn't charge this time. It didn't need to. Instead, it tilted its head, studying me with an almost human curiosity. For a moment, it was as if it recognized me, as if there was something familiar in its gaze. Then it grinned, a horrifying, tooth-filled grin that stretched impossibly wide, and took a slow step forward. "No," I muttered, backing away. "Stay back." It took another step, its claws clicking against the tile floor. I fumbled for the walkie-talkie, raising it to my mouth with trembling hands. "Brandon, Mark!" I shouted, even though I knew it was pointless. "Somebody help me!" Static crackled in response, followed by faint laughter, deep, guttural, and mocking. It wasn't coming from the walkie. It was coming from the creature. I turned and ran, not caring where I went, as long as it was away from that thing. I burst through a door at the back of the kitchen and found myself in another hallway, this one lined with shattered glass and graffiti. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. My vision blurred, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath me, but I kept moving. At last, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway. A heavy metal door, slightly ajar, with faint moonlight streaming through the crack. My heart leapt. Freedom. Escape. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the searing pain in my leg, the exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. The door loomed closer, and I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal. Then I heard it. The rapid, thunderous pounding of the creature's footsteps behind me. I threw myself against the door, shoving it open with all my strength. The cold night air hit me like a wave, sharp and bracing, and I stumbled out into the dirt. I turned and slammed the door shut, throwing the rusted bolt into place just as the creature crashed against it from the other side. The impact shook the door, but it held. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. The banging continued, relentless and furious, but I didn't wait to see if the door would hold. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the fence, my car just beyond it, parked where I had left it. The gate was still ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I climbed into the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into drive, speeding away from that cursed place without looking back. The building grew smaller in my rearview mirror, its shadow stretching impossibly long under the pale light of the moon. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the headlights illuminating the empty highway, that I allowed myself to breathe. My hands still trembled on the wheel, and my mind raced with the images of everything I had seen. Brandon, Mark, that thing. Whatever was inside that building, it wasn't human, not anymore. I drove aimlessly, unsure of where to go or what to do. I couldn't go home, not yet. I needed to think, to process what had happened, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face. The grotesque grin, the glowing eyes, the twisted remnants of humanity that clung to it like a cruel joke. I pulled into a rest stop hours later, parking beneath a flickering streetlight. My body ached, my leg throbbed, and exhaustion threatened to pull me under, but I couldn't sleep. I sat there, staring at the empty road ahead, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. Then I saw it, a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My heart stopped. I hadn't seen anyone at the rest stop, hadn't heard anyone approach. With trembling hands, I reached for the paper and unfolded it. It was a flyer, handwritten in shaky letters. "Join us for Cheeky's grand reopening next week," it read. Below that was the address of the building I had just escaped from, along with the grinning yellow dog mascot. I crumpled the flyer in my hand, my stomach twisting with dread. Whatever Cheeky's was, whatever they were hiding, it wasn't over, and I had a sinking feeling it never would be. The highway stretched on forever, its endless expanse illuminated by the dull glow of my headlights. I had driven aimlessly for hours, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a grotesque film on an infinite loop. The creature's eyes, its twisted grin, the sounds of Brandon and Mark's final moments. It was all etched into me now, as permanent as a scar. I hadn't touched the crumpled flyer since shoving it into my glove compartment. Just knowing it was there was enough to keep the dread alive. A constant reminder of what I'd seen and what I'd left behind. But the words on it were burned into my brain. Cheeky's grand reopening. Why? Why would anyone reopen that place? What could they possibly gain from letting whatever was inside run free? Unless that was the point. Unless that thing was never meant to be contained. A part of me wanted to go back, to find out more, to expose the horrors I had witnessed. But the smarter part of me knew better. This wasn't something I could fight. It wasn't something anyone could fight. The truth of that hit me harder than I wanted to admit, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. Some things are better left unknown, better left buried. And yet, I knew deep down that burying this wasn't an option. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pale orange and pink, I found myself at a truck stop on the edge of nowhere. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the handful of parked cars. I parked my car at the far end of the lot and stepped out, the cold morning air biting at my skin. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the hum of the coffee machine and the faint murmur of a radio. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile took my order, a plate of eggs and a coffee that I wasn't sure I'd be able to stomach. I sat in the far corner, my back to the wall, and watched the sparse crowd of travelers and truckers as they went about their morning. I wanted to feel safe here, in this normal, mundane place. But I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The events of the night had altered something in me, a part of my brain that refused to let me feel secure again. Every creak of the door, every shuffle of a footstep sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I kept my eyes on the window, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the parking lot. When the waitress returned with my coffee, I asked her a question, my voice quieter than I intended. "You ever heard of a place called Cheeky's?" She gave me a strange look, her brow furrowing as she set the mug down. "The old restaurant?" I nodded. "Yeah, I heard of it. Used to be one not too far from here. Closed down a while back, though." She hesitated, glancing around before leaning in closer. "Why do you ask?" I shook my head, unsure of how much to say. "Just curious. I heard some things." Her expression darkened and she folded her arms across her chest. "You hear about the guy who disappeared there? The one in the mascot suit?" "Yeah," I said, though the words felt heavy in my throat. "Well," she continued, lowering her voice to a whisper, "my cousin used to work there. He told me that place was bad news, said they did experiments or something in the back. Don't know if it's true, but after what happened, I wouldn't doubt it." "What kind of experiments?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Don't know. He didn't like to talk about it. Said it was better that way." I wanted to ask more, but she straightened up and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. My coffee sat untouched, growing colder by the second. My appetite was gone, replaced by the gnawing dread that had followed me from that cursed building. As I left the diner and got back into my car, the radio crackled to life, a familiar voice cutting through the static. It was a local station, one I'd heard a dozen times before, but the words they spoke sent a chill down my spine. "Exciting news for our listeners this morning. After years of waiting, Cheeky's is finally reopening its doors. That's right, folks, the grand reopening is just a week away. So bring the family, bring your friends, and come see what the buzz is all about." The voice was cheerful, upbeat, completely oblivious to the horrors that lay behind those boarded-up walls. I turned the radio off, my hand trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I could still see the flyer in my mind, the grinning yellow dog that now felt more like a warning than an invitation. I drove away from the truck stop, away from the diner, away from everything. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had left something unfinished. I couldn't escape the knowledge that somewhere in that dilapidated building, the thing I had seen was waiting for the doors to open, waiting for its chance to step into the world. And when it did, I knew it wouldn't stop, not until it had consumed everything in its path. Some places should never be revisited, some secrets should never be uncovered, and some doors should never be reopened.